Here we go. Okay, we're on. Wait for everybody to get online here. Pull up the text while we're at it. Okay, looks like we're starting to get people on. Sorry, it took me a minute today. I was trying to change the chat settings, but didn't quite work out the way I wanted that to. Wait a little longer for everybody to get on here. Return regulation of real estate and the environment. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Let's see. Sorry, let me just fix the screen so I can see it better. That's probably out. Here we go. Okay, let's try that. Here we go. Okay, so we're gonna continue our discussion on real estate today. Just a couple housekeeping things. So first of all, I've been getting some questions about whether or not we're going to have letter grades or pass fail. I'm still weighing that decision. I'm leaning toward letter grades, but obviously modifying a few things in light of all the changes we've had to make. What was the other thing? Anyway, and then we need some more quizzes up on Top Hat. Been trying to get those ready for you. Let's see. I did have a couple questions. Some people missed a Top Hat quiz. I'm trying to find a way to reopen that without reopening it. It's kind of tricky. So anyway, we'll see how that works. Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion on real estate. Okay, so we have last time we talked about some of the basics of property law, how a fee simple estate is essentially you owning it. Life estate is, you have it for life. It expires upon death and goes back to whoever the fee simple holder is. We talked about rights to airspace, the depths, and water. We talked about water for quite a bit because it's so important here. Remember, the two key takeaways with water rights that we want to remember for a test is number one, priority dates and how those work. So you'll have a test question and we'll do a quiz question that's similar. Something like we have 4 users. Here's how water they have and their priority dates for their water. Let's say there's a shortage and only this much water can be used. Who can still use their water, who cannot. Okay, so we'll have something like that. And then we'll also have a question about duties. Okay, so if you remember, a duty in water right law has to do with how much water you need, how many water rights you need to be able to use it for a particular purpose. We're not worried about livestock or anything like that. But we are going to use the one for irrigation. Okay, so for irrigation, remember, you need 4 acre-feet of water rights per acre of land that you're going to irrigate. Okay, so we're going to move on from water because we have a lot of other stuff. This chapter focuses a lot on easements. An easement, E-A-S-E-M-E-N-T. Okay, an easement is the right to use someone else's land. We're not going to get too technical with easements. Okay, just keep in mind that easements are basically a right to use someone else's land for a particular purpose. Okay, these are most common for utilities or roads. Okay, and that's kind of the limit or the extent rather of what I want you to remember for easements. Okay, so an easement, let's say someone has an easement to use somebody's road, or somebody's land because there's a road through it. That's an easement. Or utility companies will often have an easement to use a particular stretch of someone's land. Usually, it's defined by a certain dimension, and that uh, the dimensions across the land, and that's for access to utilities, so that the utility companies can access their work. Um, and then there is a principle. I'm not really going to test on it, but um, sorry, and I'm just double checking your text doesn't actually use this word either, but it comes up a lot, is prescriptive easement. Prescriptive easement, okay, like a prescription kind of, okay. And a prescriptive easement, it actually does come from the word a prescription. If you remember, when we talked about debts and whether or not you can enforce a debt in contract law when it becomes unenforceable, and that may run due to the statute of limitations. So, a statute of limitations, a synonym for that is a prescription or a prescriptive period. It's not used in English law. It's in um, Louisiana, where they use the civil law, the French system. That's the word they use. Anyway, so prescription in the world of law is similar to a statute of limitations, where we have a prescriptive period. And during that period, once that period is expired, something legally significant happens. Okay, so a prescriptive easement is basically, let's say you don't have permission to use somebody's land, but you've been using it as a road for several years. And it's no secret that you're using it as that road. Any normal user would know that you're using it for that purpose. It's obvious. Then that's a prescriptive easement, right? So they have a duty to stop you somehow by either fencing it off, putting up a gate, or suing you for an injunction. Remember, in contract law, so injunctions are equitable. There's a form of equitable relief, right, where you can stop somebody from doing something. And so a prescriptive easement is basically what runs after that period. If they've failed to keep you out, you've been using it for that purpose, then that prescriptive easement is now your you can use that property. Now you can't build a house on it, but you can continue to use it as you used it for the easement. Okay. So once again, that's not something we'll test on, but that's something that comes up a lot. So it's good to know. Let's see. That's it for easements. Regulation of land use. Okay. So land use regulations are interesting. Okay. So a lot of these originated from private suits, right? So if two adjoining landowners were using their property for different things, the common law, we try to find what constituted a nuisance, right? At what point is somebody's use of their own land truly interfering with somebody else's quiet enjoyment and use of their land, of their own land? So you have two neighbors. Let's say one builds that's probably going to affect their neighbors' quiet enjoyment of the property. It's loud, it's dusty, and it may affect their views, right? And so, to what extent does the law protect that person? Likewise, if somebody has a pig farm or some kind of other extensive agricultural operation, does that affect their neighbors? Do the smells, the flies, the noises, do those affect um, uh, their quiet enjoyment of the property? And different states, different municipalities, different governments have different views on um, how to treat those types of situations. Okay, so for example, um, the um, a nuisance is an interference with the use and enjoyment of one's land. Okay, so your text gives examples of nuisances: excessive noise, especially late at night, polluting activities, emissions of noxious odors. But it has to be substantial harm. It can't be minor injury. It can't be a fleeting thing. So it can't be super temporary. And it must produce the effects on a reasonable person, not someone who's peculiarly allergic to the complained of activity, right? Um, so, for example, mowing a lawn. Yesterday, I was trimming some branches, running a chainsaw, right? If I was doing that often late at night, my neighbors might have a nuisance complaint against me. But if I'm doing it, once a year during spring cleanup during the day, it's not likely to have a nuisance complaint against me. Okay. Likewise, if I had an animal that was loud, like my chickens, okay, my chickens are very quiet during the night. That's the nature of birds, right? Um, but during the day, they'll make occasional squawking noises right before they lay an egg. And I'm a good neighbor, right? So I told my neighbors, hey, if my chickens bother you, I'm happy to turn them into soup. But I've got masonry walls around, like brick walls around the backyard and everything. And they said they've never even heard it. And they're just happy to have a young family on the street because it's kind of an older neighborhood. So, but if it was a problem, I tend to be one to talk to my neighbors and over communicate and see if that is a problem. And if it was a problem, I'd find a way to remedy it. But if they wanted to complain about it without talking to me in person or file a nuisance suit against me, they could if it was a chronic noise, if it was often, if it was especially in the night, right? Or likewise, if I wasn't exercising proper animal husbandry techniques and I was letting the smells become noxious, I wasn't cleaning things up the way I should, then they could have a nuisance complaint against me. So people always have a private cause of action. They can sue you civilly for nuisances, but in municipalities, or in governments, okay, you also have often land use regulations that get around some of these private nuisance needs. Okay, so for example, we go back to the rock crusher. Okay, rock crushing is considered a heavy industrial activity. So rather than having people set up crushing companies wherever they want and then relying on the private sector to file suit, local governments have instead implemented these nuisance laws. And these nuisance laws require the um, uh, will use the government to file suit on behalf of the private sector, essentially, on behalf of private citizens, because it's a common enough issue. So the so if what they do is they classify activities such as crushing rocks as heavy industrial, and they have designated areas for that. They have a heavy industrial zone, and that's totally permitted within a heavy industrial zone. If you build a house next to a heavy industrial zone, um, too bad is kind of the view of that, right? Because we've designated this area as heavy industrial. And if you want to complain about noise and dust, That's just too bad. Okay. Because we have that designated area where they can do that, where they can do the noisy, stinky, dirty things. Same thing for agriculture. We have agricultural zones. Um, we have commercial zones for certain types of businesses, or light industrial or residential. We have mixed use zones where you might expect, if you live in a mixed use zone, that your neighbor may have an apartment building, but may also have businesses. You may experience traffic on your street due to those businesses. So that's kind of the purpose of zoning, is to look at these nuisances, and try to um, rather than having people sue each other privately for nuisances all the time, they designate certain areas for certain types of activities, and then the city or the state or the county will file suit against violators of those uses, so that the private individuals don't have to file nuisances all the time. And that's, philosophically, some people are on different sides of that debate, but we're focusing more on the legal side. So legally, that's kind of where it stands right now. See if I'm missing anything else here. Um, there's a few other things, but nothing that we need to cover. Um, Oh, right. Okay. I did want to cover private regulation of land use by agreement. Okay. So this is, so let's say, rather than focusing on private individuals determining in the courts what is and is not a nuisance, or depending on the government, a lot of people enter into private contracts. Okay. So these private contracts will say, look, this is what our land is can be used for. This is what is okay. This is what is not okay. And if you disobey the covenants, we'll assess fines, and maybe even go to the courts to enforce these private covenants. Okay, so this once again operates under a contract law type of uh, system. This is where like homeowners associations will come into play, or condominium agreements, if it's all within one building, um, or even just other private covenants, between a few landowners for a particular purpose. We see this a lot with well sharing agreements. So if you're on a shared well, you're not on a commercial water system, but you're just some people all tapped into the same well for your water. You might have an agreement like this. Okay, so in the United States, we believe in the freedom to contract. We want people to be allowed to contract, and so when they enter into these contracts and want to enforce covenants of those contracts between landowners, we generally uphold those as long as they don't violate other um, uh, public policy priorities. Um, so once again, philosophically, people may differ on their views of homeowners associations, things like that. But from a legal standpoint, these are valid, and they are a substitute or an augmentation of relying upon governments or upon private parties suing each other for what a nuisance is. Okay. Um, let's see. Public control of land use through eminent domain. Okay, this is kind of interesting. So, eminent domain is where the government can take property for a public use. Um, Once again, we're not going to get into the philosophical debate here. We're just going to focus on the legal side. Okay, so from a legal standpoint, is this okay or not? And that usually depends on a state legislature, whether or not the state legislature says this is okay. If it is, then it's fine. If not, then it's not. Okay. So eminent domain is basically a process where, for a public use, a government can seize property owned by private citizens um, for that public use. The key here with eminent domain, though, is that they have to provide what is called just compensation. Okay. or fair compensation. And there are varying ways to determine what fair compensation is. We won't get into those, but just keep in mind that fair compensation is what's required in eminent domain proceedings. The other thing is what is allowed, and once again, this is determined by a state legislature. But if they say it's okay, then it's okay. So if the if it, and we'll use a city as an example. Okay, so if the city wants to take someone's land to expand an airport, is that okay? Yes. Because generally a city or another local partner will own the airport. Okay, so they can use it for city property. Same thing if they're expanding a cemetery, if they're expanding any other city amenity or roads, they can take the property and use it for that public use. And as long as they give the owners fair compensation, they're okay. Where it gets a little more heated is where we use it for a private use. So, can a city take someone's land and then turn around and sell it to a private developer for a shopping mall or a new housing development or something like that? The answer is yes. Okay, legally, as long as a state legislature has allowed that, um, they can do that. So not only for a public use, as in use by the government, but also public use, as in any other use that the city deems appropriate for its use, even if that is selling it to a private developer for building some kind of development. Okay. There are right now that is legal in Utah as well. There's a lot of political debate on whether to ban that and to change that law, and we'll see where that goes. Let's see. The last term on this little section I wanted to cover is a variance. Okay, so a variance is you can think of as an exception. Okay, so a variance is let's say, for example, well, we'll go back to the crushing company example. Okay, so a crushing company, once again, we're crushing rocks, we're creating a lot of noise and a lot of dust, which is why it's considered a nuisance in many zones and why we create heavy industrial zones for activities like that. Okay. And let's say a crushing company has developed some kind of new technology where the crushing is all done indoors. It's quiet. It's no more loud than, say, a dishwasher or something like that. The dust is all contained within the indoor facility. And so they want a variance to do it in a general commercial zone where you'd have shopping, retail type stuff like that. Okay. A local city council or a county commission, for example, could decide whether or not to grant that variance. If it was a private contract like an HOA, same thing. If a homeowner wants to do something that's not within the covenants or it's prohibited, but they for some reason want an exception, whether because they found ways to mitigate the harm that would be generally caused by that activity, or just because they feel they deserve an exception for some reason, then they can always request a variance, and that could be granted by the governing body. Okay, so variance is just an exception to the rules, usually accompanied with some kind of special circumstance that shows why the rules just don't make sense in that case. Okay. There's a section in this chapter about environmental law, and I don't want to focus too much on all of it just because it's so broad. So keeping in mind that federal, state, and local governments have varying degrees of authority to regulate environmental impacts upon land users and can therefore govern the use. The key takeaway on this one that I want you to understand and that you'll be tested on is, where does the federal government get the authority to regulate the environment and land use based on environmental impacts? And that answer is the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution has a Commerce Clause in it that states that Congress may regulate activities which impact interstate commerce. Okay, um, so commerce between the states. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and all the laws that create it and govern it are rooted in that Commerce Clause. Okay. So you'll see some of the lawsuits claiming Environmental Protection Agency overreach. They usually go back to that Commerce Clause stating that a particular regulation does not necessarily um, govern something that impacts interstate commerce. Therefore, it's overly broad and beyond the reach of the powers of the EPA, and therefore should not be governed by the federal government, but should be given back to the states per the 10th Amendment. Okay. And so anyway, there's differing philosophies on that, but just keep in mind that from the federal government standpoint, any environmental regulation is derives its authority from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So I want you to remember that. And then feel free to read the rest of that, but there's a lot. So that's it for this chapter. We're gonna that's a lot. So what I'm gonna work on is I think at this point I'm gonna send out 2 quizzes. So the one is gonna be a comprehensive contracts quiz. And I might give you a few days on that one. And then the other one is going to be a very long quiz on this first chapter of land use, just because it covers a lot of different things that we will have on your final. So I'm going to put that together as well, so you have that. Anyway, so we're gonna probably stop there today, even though it's kind of short, just because it's a lot of material to cover. So we'll give you all a chance to study that. I'll try to get those quizzes up pretty quick, and then we'll talk on Thursday about real estate transfers and how sale and real estate transactions work. Okay. Feel free to text me if you guys have any questions or if you need anything, even if it's like food or anything. I'm glad that many of you are going home to your permanent homes, but if you need anything, let me know. I'm happy to help. Okay, we'll see you guys.